I mentioned in the first segment, but when truth in a culture is rejected, as it has been in America, clearly, we know it has. When God's definition of right and wrong, moral or immoral, just or unjust, when that is repudiated and replaced, as an example, with what the Supreme Court says about life or marriage, or take your pick, or members of Congress believe to be true, as they have done and are doing, then I submit that it's impossible for any sector of the culture, or let's put it this way, extraordinarily difficult, to raise up an objective standard of truth or what is right or wrong within their respective, if the culture at large has rejected the concept that there are some things that are always right or always wrong. And I think such is the case today in regard to the fallout and the continuing pursuit of dangerous COVID policies that are destroying Americans' livelihoods, robbing our children of a proper education, enlarging definitely the size of government, and clearly inducing panic and anxiety on citizens generally, and clearly, in some cases, violating basic medical treatments for health and actually, in my opinion, forcing medical professionals to violate their basic Hippocratic oath, which is to do no harm. One area of visible policy concerns the practice of wearing masks, and we know, and that's the visible one. The CDC director says it's the solution, guaranteed to drive the virus into the ground in 6 weeks if everybody does it. And many others say that actually, if that were to be done, the population as a whole would be more susceptible to other viruses or any viruses after they took the mask off. So what's the truth? Twila, let me go to you. You've spoken out a lot on this issue of wearing masks, and it is something that's worthy because there's a lot surrounding it. But I'd like to keep, if we could right now, our emotions out of this. Let's stay on the facts. So from an efficacious perspective, meaning does it actually help or not, does mask wearing, and I'm going to qualify because all these words are important, does mask wearing by healthy people limit the spread of the coronavirus or anything else as far as that goes, but coronavirus? And from a medical perspective, should it be done? Or from a medical perspective, should it really not be done?
Okay, well, there's so much that could be said about here, but I'm going to just start with the World Health Organization, which I'm not exactly a fan of, but in this case, they're marching to the tune of science, and they have said several things, and they've refused to bend, much to other people's dismay. So I'm going to quote from them. Here we go. The wide use of masks by healthy people in the community setting is not supported by current evidence and carries uncertainties and critical risks. And that was June 5th, 2020. The other thing that they say in that same document is there is no evidence that wearing a mask, whether medical or other types, by healthy persons in the wider community setting, including universal community masking, can prevent them from infection from respiratory viruses, including COVID-19. So that's coming out of the World Health Organization. And what's really funny about that, I think, is that the governor of Nevada quoted the World Health Organization about COVID-19, I think maybe 6 times in his executive order, but he didn't quote this as he mandated masks for everybody in the state, inside and outside, private spaces and public spaces, all mandated to wear masks. So somehow missed these 2 statements.
Twila, this takes us, I think, to a very basic question as it relates to herd immunity, and that is from a medical and health perspective. Are we trying to achieve the impossible and maybe even creating medical harm by trying to prevent the spread of this virus rather than just living life as normal and responding to the virus if a person is affected just like we would do for the common cold or any other flu virus?
Well, I don't know if I don't really think it affects herd immunity because, at least according to former Minnesota State epidemiologist, who was also the interim director of the CDC at one point, he's talking about COVID-19 being aerosolized, and so he has said several things in a video which I think might be of interest to your listeners. One of them, which should stick in your memory, is unless it's a tight fit, it's like fixing 3 of your 5 screen doors in your submarine. The air just goes in and out the sides. I say if you don't have an N95, you're not protected. So, your question here is about herd immunity, or what we call community immunity, since we're not animals. But everybody else says herd immunity, is that, it's as though the mask stops it, but it doesn't stop it. And at one point, Dr. Ostholm in one of the videos talks about the highest frequency of mask wearing in the world was in Hubei, China, where almost everybody was wearing one publicly, but it did not stop the virus. And then, of course, there's this one study that nobody's really talking about on cloth masks that says that the filtration of a surgical mask, the filtration of a cloth mask was 97%, which means that it filtered out only 9% of the particles. And interestingly enough, coronavirus is this teeny tiny itsy bitsy thing, which is a lot smaller than a lot of other bacteria and things that that are out in your breath. It's really, really, really tiny. And so he says, if the authors concluded that the cloth mask should not be recommended for healthcare workers, and so he says if they're not recommended for healthcare workers, the only how can cloth masks ever be expected to reduce the incidence of COVID-19, right? So what we're looking at here is essentially a bunch of people who just, as he would say, they're using emotion, not science. They just want to feel like they're doing something. But, his concern is that if we are okay with public health doing this kind of thing, we're going to be okay when they say to people with XYZ medical condition, this is what we need to keep you safe. This is what you have to do to keep you safe. And this will and they'll use the whole masking thing. Well, we did it for masks, so we can do it for this. We can require this, in order to save people. And so I think, that is, setting a precedent that the government can tell you have to do something to protect yourself, is a dangerous place to go.
Twila, let me ask you this. When you look at countries like Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, that none of those have instituted any kind of face mask requirement or policy, social distancing, since, really, it's physically impossible. Someone said the other day, if you tried to do that in Japan or Taiwan or Singapore, you'd have people out in the ocean because you just cannot socially distance. And yet, according to the most recent numbers coming out of Taiwan, only 7 people out of 35 million have died, at least from confirmed complications of COVID. So how can that kind of information that should be incredibly encouraging and certainly should be factored in, how can that be ignored or discarded by those within the medical profession?
Well, my answer to that is, although the medical profession may be in complete agreement with what the facts, there's absolutely no there's no studies that show any evidence. As the World Health Organization said, there's no evidence. And even there was research after the Spanish flu. I believe it was 3 studies, and they all said that the mask didn't work. But here's the deal. Most of the medical professionals today are, 1, very, very busy, and so they're not looking at other things. But 2, they're employees. And when you're an employee and you're no longer independent like doctors used to be, before the government got so intrusive and before managed care was, pushed on all of us by the government, because they're employees, it's very difficult for them to speak up. It's very difficult for them to change because their job is on the line. It used to be they were independent. Their job wasn't on the line. Now they're employees. So I think that this has all become very political. Some people say it's all about the election. It's making everybody scared until we get till November 4th. I have no idea. But the fact of the matter is there's something that epidemiologist John Ioannidis said, which I think is a lot of the problem here. And he called it the domino effect. And here's a quote from him. Once you believe in some exaggerated estimates and you start making decisions that may be extreme, there's a sense that if you don't follow up with even more stringent decisions and even more severe decisions, you may be claimed to be negligent. And so this domino effect, right? So you do something and then you have to do something more and then you have to do something more. Because that's how you're going to assure people that you're keeping them safe. But, it's just not true.
Twila, I think that's a great point, and I really personally believe that's a lot of it, particularly when you get into the political circles, because once somebody stuck their neck out, if they back up, they have to say, well, I was wrong, and at that point they equate that with weakness. But in fact, today, in this climate, it would be the best thing that anybody could do to say, I was wrong, let's go back to the way we were.